Welcome, everyone. This talk is sponsored by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication here at the Yale School of the Environment. Based at Yale University School of the Environment, the Center for Environmental Communication, or YCEC for short, focuses on 4 areas. First, we conduct research on the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental attitudes and behavior. Second, we teach students and train working professionals. Third, we convene a global network of climate communication scholars and practitioners. Finally, we inform and engage the public through environmental journalism, including Yale Climate Connections, a climate-focused news service that engages many thousands of people every day and includes a short daily radio story that airs on about 680 stations nationwide. Here's some on the logistics. The chat is closed. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window to ask questions and to vote for your favorite questions so they rise to the top and we see them. We will make a recording of this conversation available on our website, and we will send a link to everyone who registered. Today's talk will be moderated by Dr. Jennifer Marlon. Dr. Marlon, she's a senior research scientist and lecturer at the Yale School of the Environment and the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. She obtained her PhD and MS in geography from the University of Oregon and is an expert on public perceptions of climate change and extreme weather and paleoclimatology. At Yale, she co-teaches biology, the world, and us, and environmental data visualization and communication. She has published over 60 peer-reviewed articles. I hand it off to Dr. Jennifer Marlon.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you all so much for joining us. I am completely delighted today to be joined by our distinguished speaker, Alice Hill, who is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations. Alice is an expert on catastrophic threats and adaptation. She served as the special assistant to President Barack Obama, where she led the development of national policy to prepare for catastrophic risks, including climate change and biological threats. She was also a senior director for resilience policy on the National Security Council. And prior to her focus on adaptation and risk, she served as a federal prosecutor and judge. So she brings a very unique perspective to the issue of climate change and how laws can both constrain and enable our responses to climate change. She's also the co-author of Building a Resilient Tomorrow, an amazing, fantastic book, highly recommend it. It was published in 2019. And likewise, she authored The Fight for Climate After COVID-19, published last year in 2021, and more books coming, I hear. In these books, Alice argues that mitigation is no longer enough. The greater attention and investment is clearly needed now in adaptation. And there are many, many things that we can be doing to better prepare for our warming world. She also argues that there are many lessons to learn from our experience with COVID that can help us as we turn increasingly toward preparing for climate changes. So just a bit more about the format. We'll hear for Alice for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion and conversation. And again, very keen to hear your questions, so use the Q&A. Again, we're delighted to have you with us, Alice. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn this over to you now.
Well, thank you. I'm so delighted to have a chance to speak with all of you this afternoon, and what a pleasure to do this with you, Jennifer. I want to thank the Yale Center for Environmental Communication. I'm a huge fan of the center's work and a subscriber of their work. If anything has become clear in the last few years, it's that the catastrophic risks of pandemics and climate change have the capacity to cause widespread and cascading harm to lives, livelihoods, and economies. It's also become clear that our preparation for these risks can greatly reduce the damage they cause. Now, as you've heard, I haven't always focused on catastrophic risk. In 2008, I was a judge on the Los Angeles Superior Court in California. Now, I'm often asked by students, how did you go from being a state court judge to making federal policy? The answer is simple. Be nice to those you sit next to in school. I went to law school with Janet Napolitano, and shortly after the election of President Barack Obama in November 2008, my phone rang. On the other end, Janet Napolitano asked, how would you like to come to Washington? President Obama had recruited her to become Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Now, DHS is the third largest agency in the US federal government, behind the Departments of Defense and Veterans Affairs. It was, of course, born out of the events of 9/11. It has a huge anti-terrorism focus. It includes everything from immigration customs enforcement to federal emergency management, to the Coast Guard, to TSA, and even the Secret Service. So in 2009, I headed to Washington to join Secretary Napolitano as her senior counselor. Around that time, President Obama issued one of his first executive orders on climate change. The order required, among other things, that all federal agencies begin to plan for the impacts of climate change. And I was put in charge of creating DHS's first ever climate adaptation plan. Secretary Napolitano also asked me to head the DHS leadership group on biological threats. DHS had the responsibility of coordinating federal, state, and local efforts to prepare for biological threats, ranging from an influenza pandemic to an aerosolized anthrax attack by terrorists. It was because of this work and my time on the National Security Council staff as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Resilience Policy that I realized the profound similarities climate change and pandemics bear. When COVID emerged as a threat in early 2020, it occurred to me that its spread could inform people's understanding of the catastrophic risk of climate change, and hence the book. Numerous lessons have emerged from the pandemic that can aid preparation for climate change impacts, and the impacts are becoming ever more apparent. We can look out our windows, deeper droughts, more extreme rainfall, longer, hotter, deeper heat waves, bigger wildfires, and sea level rise. First and foremost for both of these threats is that leadership matters. Just compare the experience of South Korea and the United States with COVID. Now, while US leadership was downplaying the risks, remember, President Trump initially insisted it's just one case. South Korea mobilized like an army. Now, it had had the earlier scare with SARS and MERS, and it used the lessons from those experiences to really ramp up quickly. It even borrowed from the Starbucks line, or the Starbucks business, to set up drive-through testing. And it also immediately put in place contact tracing. As of this week, with a population of about 51 million people, South Korea has experienced only 27,665 deaths. And of course, it's in close proximity of China and experienced the pandemic earlier. It is one of the highest performing countries in the fight against COVID, however. It has vaccinated almost 90% of its population and worked to protect the most at risk among them. In contrast, the United States, with its population of 332 million, has experienced over 1 million deaths. Its death toll is among the highest among developed countries in the world. Another lesson is that supply chains will break as catastrophic risks unfold. Remember the run for toilet paper or the shortage of masks and other protective equipment? Just a few weeks ago, the New York Times ran a headline to the effect that climate change could, and they use the word could, disrupt supply chains. but it already has, and it will continue to do so. Take Puerto Rico. Before Hurricanes Maria and Irma struck the island in 2017, causing Puerto Rico to experience the second longest blackout in history, the island had become a global hub for the manufacture of pharmaceuticals and medical supplies. About 8% of the medicines taken by Americans were made on the island. But the hurricanes destroyed the electric grid. And even where manufacturers relied on generators, employees couldn't get to work. There was just too much debris on the roads. Soon, hospitals around the globe began to run out of essential items like intravenous bags, the preferred method of delivery for everything from chemotherapy to painkillers. The cost of intravenous bags skyrocketed by 600%. Hospitals turned to syringes as a replacement. In turn, those supplies dwindled and costs increased. In short, when it comes to pandemics and climate change impacts, nations must plan for supply chain disruptions. Businesses need to plan for supply chain disruptions. And what does that mean? It means those chains, those very reedy-like thin chains that we've spread like a net all over the globe, they need to be strengthened, thickened, and shortened so that the supplies are at the ready. And we should also consider what we need to have in stockpiles ready to go, either on a national basis or a regional basis to keep populations safe. Another lesson is that the most vulnerable suffer the most. Women, girls, people with disabilities, marginalized populations all suffered deeply under COVID. But one of the most striking things for me, certainly as I did more research as to these impacts, is just how devastating these two risks are for girls' lives. When disasters strike in poor countries, girls are often the first to be pulled out of school and often the last to eat. They suffer higher rates of malnutrition. They're sold into child marriage at the age of 3 to feed the rest of the family, or they're trafficked into prostitution. Again, COVID has provided a lesson for climate preparedness in the area of protecting these populations, building robust social nets, as many countries did during the pandemic, seemingly overnight, can keep families from making these desperate choices. The spread of COVID also revealed that we need to engage in regional solutions, that as we bring ideas closer to home, we can prepare across borders. Neither of these risks, pandemics or climate change impacts, honor the carefully crafted jurisdictional boundaries that we have across the globe. And here in the United States, we have some 400,000 separate jurisdictional entities making decisions that affect climate choices and adaptation and preparation. We need to plan across those borders to be effective. We need greater insurance protection. Insurance, when it's given immediately, puts people back on their feet immediately, and that keeps communities healthy, keeps families healthy, saves livelihoods. And we can even explore delivering insurance in advance of bad events so that the necessary supplies can be obtained, so that the houses can be protected, and people can make sure they are keeping their families safe in advance of the event. These two threats, pandemics and climate change impacts, also act like threat multipliers. They make bad conditions even worse. As a result, they open the door to criminal activity. And we saw this during the pandemic. Extremists and criminal networks used the pandemic to expand their territory and increase recruitment. The pandemic revealed that failed, weak, or sluggish responses in the immediate aftermath of a disaster provides the openings for bad actors to use humanitarian aid, for example, to recruit members and just take over more land and more communities. As COVID-19 began to spread, members of the Sinaloa cartel delivered hand sanitizers and other pandemic supplies in boxes stamped with the picture of the leader of the cartel. And the mayor in Italy complained about the mafia using the pandemic to make criminal inroads. I suspect that the same thing is happening in Pakistan right now. With crops demolished, the country facing over 27% inflation rate, a huge debt crisis, and a third of the country flooded, there are a lot of opportunities for terrorists to take advantage, to garner more members. In fact, that's what we saw when Pakistan suffered its last huge flood in 2010. It is because of the parallels between these two catastrophic risks that the world's response to the COVID-19 pandemic provides valuable lessons that we can use to prepare for climate change. But there's one critical lesson that applies to climate that COVID doesn't bring home. Namely, that the past is no longer a reliable guide to the future. And it's that lesson that continues, or the lack of understanding of the lesson, that continues to stymie our progress on preparing for climate change impacts. Pandemics, of course, have plagued the entire arc of human history. In the 14th century, the Black Death killed 1/3 of the world's population. In 1918, 15 million lost their lives in the Spanish flu pandemic. As a result of hundreds of years of experience with pandemics, humans, in theory, know a lot about what to do to prepare. On the other hand, climate change impacts like higher temperature extremes, bigger and hotter wildfires, and rising sea level are unfamiliar threats. How many times have you seen a media account quoting a disaster victim saying something to the effect, "I've lived here for X number of years and I've never seen anything like it"? Well, that is the essence of climate change. It will bring greater extremes than ever experienced in recorded history. Even if global emissions dropped to zero today, the world's population would continue to suffer worsening impacts for some time because heating has been baked in from past emissions. And of course, we're seeing emissions occur naturally now as well. This summer, some 7,000 heat records were broken in the United States. In a stable climate, records, of course, get broken, but they bob back and forth a little like a seesaw between hot and cold. With a change in climate, we see more heat than cold and more records shattered. According to a meteorological historian, there has never been a heat event like that experienced in China this summer. All of these unprecedented disruptions make clear that humans can no longer rely on the assumption that has guided them through our past 10,000 years, that every design choice about all of our systems can assume that the past will guide us. But that assumption is a poor one now. The changes happening now mean that countries, communities, people must plan for a future that is unfamiliar and for a climate that is no longer stable. And this very unfamiliarity and instability of these risks leaves humanity deeply unprepared. Our planning simply doesn't yet reflect the changes that are ahead, much less those that are occurring right now. This summer, the extraordinary heat experienced across the globe, the Pacific West, China, Europe, Pakistan, Afghanistan, has caused roads to buckle, transmission lines to sag, train tracks to kink from the heat from the sun, which risks derailment, and nuclear power stations to shut down. Utilities have shut off power to avoid the risk of wildfires. Homes have gone up in smoke. Floods have torn away bridges and buildings. Rivers used for transport have become too low for shipping, like the Rhine. None of this infrastructure was designed, built, operated, or maintained with climate change impacts in mind. In a particularly surprising turn of events, failure to account for the effects of climate change also led to New Mexico's largest wildfire in its history. What is known as the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak fire originated from 2 prescribed burns in the state's national forest. Now, prescribed burns, firefighters will tell you these are necessary. They're intentionally set fires designed to clear out dry vegetation so that wildfires don't burn out of control. But the Hermit's Peak prescribed blaze quickly swelled out of control, merging with another uncontrolled fire, the Calf Canyon fire, which was also a prescribed burn, ignited by the U.S. Forest Service to reduce future fire risk. The combined flames engulfed over 340,000 acres and destroyed hundreds of homes. A recent report by the U.S. Forest Service found that the agency had, quote, depended on multiple miscalculations, poor weather data, and underestimated how dry conditions were in the Southwest when fire crews ignited the prescribed burns. What this shows is that decision-making does not yet reflect the fundamental threat posed by climate change. The future doesn't look like what we're going through now. And if we continue to assume it does, people will die, livelihoods will be lost, and economies will suffer far beyond what is necessary or what will happen. One of the most basic steps towards better preparation is to make sure that decision makers consider future risk. And how do we do that? We engage in planning. Planning is a universally recognized way to improve disaster outcomes. A national adaptation plan, for example, can establish clear strategic priorities, clarify roles and responsibilities, establish metrics to measure how we're doing, prioritize which investments make sense, define pathways for coordinating adaptation efforts with those of state and local entities, as well as the private sector. It can also drive home the imperative to plan for the future, not the past. It can improve emergency response, ensuring sufficient resources to respond to multiple consecutive or simultaneous disasters. And it can work to reinforce those supply chains to prevent the abrupt breaks that cause extensive harm to widespread populations. Now, other nations have already developed national adaptation plans. China just released an update to its 2013 National Adaptation Strategy. The stated goal, to become a climate resilient nation by 2035. Germany created its plan in 2008, Japan in 2015, and Russia in 2020. The Netherlands began active adaptation planning in 2007 and currently builds flood defenses that can withstand the 1 in 10,000 year flood. New Zealand just released its plan, and Canada is in the process of crafting its own. At least 38 developing countries also have climate adaptation plans to help unify national efforts to prepare for current and future impacts. But unfortunately, the United States, which suffers many more economic losses than other countries as a result of climate-fueled events, currently lacks a national climate adaptation plan. And without a national plan, the United States tends to wait for disasters to happen before addressing the risks. When disasters do strike, often causing lengthy breaks in delivery of food and medicine, the response is very costly. Yet research shows that spending before disaster strikes saves up to $15 in recovery costs for every $1 spent in risk reduction. And each $1 used to make infrastructure climate resilient saves $4 in post-disaster reconstruction. This means to ensure both short and long-term resilience, decisions about investments in infrastructure, land management practices, building codes must consider the current and future risks posed by climate change. It's going to take increased efforts in both mitigation and adaptation to meet the crisis we're currently facing. Confronting the climate challenge requires the work of everyone to find ways to not just cut harmful greenhouse gas emissions, although that is an imperative, but also to adapt for the impacts that will continue to arrive. Climate change is an all hands on deck problem. And the question for each of us is, what do we dare to do about it? So with that, I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to joining you in this fight for climate after COVID-19. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Alice. And thank you to the audience for all of your questions coming in. This is such a critical topic and lots of varied questions. One of the questions that's generating some interest has to do with communication, and it has to do with addressing some of these concerns that you're raising about how the U.S. is falling behind and why the U.S. Is lagging in this area. And in part, as we know about climate change and its political polarization, this has to do with so-called deniers, or people who are dismissive about the issue as a whole. A lot of people focus attention on this group because they can wield a lot of influence in preventing us from establishing plans or even having productive conversations about this topic. And yet I also know that in some ways too much attention goes on to so-called deniers, and the groups really resisting action, and not enough attention goes on the broader public and the people who want to take steps and support action, but don't know where to start. They don't have the expertise. So let me just ask you a broad question about communicating this and helping people understand that with COVID and with climate, you hear the phrase, no one is safe until we're all safe, right? That happens with vaccines and building herd immunity, but that also happens with climate change, because when you have wildfires in one state, the smoke goes to another state. When you have water shortages in one area, it affects other areas. So really, this is, it's a cross-boundary, cross-border issue, and it's been very difficult to communicate that broadly and to get people on board and to help people understand that. And so what I guess I'll just let you address that, this issue of communication, and how to better convey the kinds of ideas that you're talking about.
Well, look, I am not a scientist. I am a former judge, so I'm not made uncomfortable by having to study material that is not directly in my discipline, but drawing conclusions. I don't make it a practice to engage with flat out deniers who say it's not happening. I mean, I don't, the consensus science is there. I know if they were in a courtroom, you don't hear that in a courtroom, by the way, because it wouldn't fly. It would be against all the evidence that's out there, and a court has to accept if it's reliable enough. And climate science on the point of whether it's human caused is certainly reliable, and whether these, I believe the science is now there on attribution science, that we could say, for example, as they've just said, that the flooding in Pakistan was likely worsened by climate change, by human caused emissions. So that debate wouldn't occur except in the public debate. It would not occur in a courtroom, so I don't engage in it. Now, the broader issue about what do we value and should we invest in this, I think that sometimes the economic issues aren't as well communicated, particularly on the adaptation side. We see a lot of resistance to building codes, for example, that, it's going to make the houses too expensive or the buildings too expensive if we build them to be climate resilient, or even just to the latest building codes. That's why they're not adopted. But there are two issues there. First, if the structure is damaged, our studies show that for every dollar you spend on having the latest building code and enforcing that building code, you save $11 in damages. And who's typically paying those damages? Federal taxpayers, or an insurance company. But what you're seeing is private insurance says, we don't want to do that anymore. We're not going to insure these houses like that because they're not safe. So we need to explain the value of this and explain that A house that collapses isn't affordable for the person who just purchased it, who may be a person of limited means. This is their primary asset, and now it's gotten wiped out, or they learn that a private insurer will not insure it because it's too risky, it's too in wildfire zone. So we have to look at who's responsible for these risks and what's the life of the structure. And as soon as the building's built, the ownership may be transferred to somebody else, but we need to make sure that that person to whom it's transferred can rely on the safety of the structure for, to be reasonably okay. Building codes are not a sexy topic. I think everyone assumes, hey, I got my house. It's, I got this report. It's okay. The community allowed for this development to go on, but actually we know that a lot of these structures will not stand. And we're seeing that in Louisiana. The wind speeds are getting too high. In Florida, the wind speeds are getting too high. And in California, the wildfires are just increasing. So we see private insurers saying, I don't know. I don't know if I want to get property insurance on these particular properties. And it's become a growing crisis in those states. And more, I suspect, will follow, because these structures are just not built for this. And what does that do in the long run to the value of the asset if you can't get insurance? Or if it collapses, same problem.
Indeed. And so the economics are clearly central to this. Do you think the economics of these dynamics is that the most productive way to engage people? I mean, what about issues of equity or women's rights or future generations? Or
well, I think for me personally, I try to engage, particularly if I'm not over Zoom. It's hard to know my audience, right. But if I'm in person, engage them where they are. And climate change affects everything. It affects every discipline. It affects everything. And that's when I was assigned this task at DHS, I didn't have a climate background. I was fortunate to speak to some of the top climate scientists in the federal government, and they have fabulous scientists. And once I had an opportunity to spend time with that material, I had what I call my aha moment, where and everyone on our task force that had to write this report and this plan, I had an aha moment. Wow, this is going to affect all of the mission space of DHS, which is extremely broad. It's going to affect everything we know, including our ecosystem. And once we can engage with people with what they're interested in and show how that will impact them, what they can do, it's very important to cut emissions, why this matters, but also the adaptation side. I think that you can help people have their aha moment. It's Catherine Hale wrote a book about communication and climate, and it really comes down to, and this is what the studies still show, is that we're not having enough conversations. We're not really engaging. We got Thanksgiving coming up. Let's really talk. And we just aren't. We've seen an explosion in the media, I'd say, since 2019 of reporting. But I think there was a recent polling. It shows the great divergence. One poll shows the great divergence politically, which is a separate challenge, but also a poll that showed that, in essence, people underestimated how much their neighbor cared about climate change. So let's have those conversations. And then what do those conversations lead to? Well, in democracy, I hope they lead to more political activity aimed at making sure the nation is prepared and doing as much as it can to mitigate the risks from climate change, including cutting our emissions rapidly to hopefully keep to the 1.5 if we possibly can. But it's the dynamics, I suspect, will change over time, given that we're seeing so many examples now of climate change. When I started in this space, it was rare to see any discussion in the media of climate change impacts, and now there's a daily dose.
There is indeed a daily dose and many opportunities as we continue to experience the extreme weather. And we do know the misperception you mentioned is exactly right. That's one of the most pervasive misperceptions out there that we find in our polling research, right? That people underestimate how much other people care about the issue and want to engage. And so we don't talk about it. We also anticipate conflict and polarization, so we don't want to bring it up, or we think it's too sciencey and that we're not experts. There are all these barriers to talking about it. But I think you're right. The media is doing a much better job paying attention. Some media are doing a better job paying attention. There are still so many windows of opportunity in a way, however, where we could be connecting the dots and we're not for the public, and the media needs to help do that. But there has been more momentum, right, with the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure package. So what is your take on those efforts, and you know, what is about to happen? What is that going to cover, and what additional efforts need to be addressed, like the National Adaptation Plan? How does that fit in?
Well, I think the Biden administration, with the latest Inflation Reduction Act, has pulled off a major accomplishment. Of course, it's a compromise bill, and of course, it doesn't have everything that we would hope that would be in it. And we also, it reflects political realities. It's mostly about carrots. It's not about sticks. It's mostly about giving incentives, tax breaks, other means, money for research, to encourage better behavior rather than the regulation. But it's a major step forward and increases the credibility of the United States, I believe, internationally, and also with a 10-year run will, I believe, yield technologies and approaches that could benefit the rest of the world and certainly will benefit the United States. So major accomplished, as is the infrastructure bill. Mm-hmm. Where I still hope the Biden administration will focus in a more coordinated way is on this preparation side. You know, I was on a panel recently with a mayor from a smallish town, and he shared that after a disaster, his town had to coordinate with some 25 agencies. Now, as I reflect, it could have included state agencies, but also federal agencies. That's, you know, for a small town mayor, we got, as I said, tons of these jurisdictional setups that need to be able to plan and coordinate. To ask them to go learn about FEMA, and then go learn about HUD, and then go learn about the Army Corps of Engineers so they can access this money is asking a lot. Mm-hmm. I'll never forget, I've cited her so many times, a mayor from a small town in Alabama, Perdido Beach, very aptly named, facing sea level rise, bigger storms, extreme heat, and other challenges. She said, I get it. I understand I have climate risk, but what am I supposed to do about it? Mm-hmm. And similar, if you go down to the parcel level, you're deciding where to live. It's hard to get that information still. They just released a new website. It probably will be more useful, I predict, for communities. But right now you go to the First Street Foundation, which is a philanthropy that has done this work and done the modeling. And you can get parcel level. So you can go to Redfin or some other. And their research shows that if we do have disclosure of these risks, and it just came out with a study, it affects people's decision as to whether they want to buy in a flood zone. So I see that there's much more that can be done, and a very good place to start would be to have a national adaptation plan. Our current approach is to have all these agencies have their own plans. If anyone's ever worked in the federal government, you understand that's at risk of creating some areas of or some gaps between what the agencies are doing. You tend to find, in my experience, and I don't mean to be pejorative, but this is just a reaction when agencies are trying to work together, it's like, you're not the boss of me. This is the way we do it. You do it your way. And unfortunately, if you think about that from that mayor's perspective, that just means this is too hard. I got to go attend to the immediate problems in my town, and somebody else will work on this problem later on. Puts us at great risk.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people in the audience are interested in hearing your take on the global picture and not just the issues in the U.S. As significant as they are. But here's a question, given the large disparities and inequities surrounding resources, energy, wealth, climate change impacts between, rich and emerging economies, and the fact that many of them are still dealing with COVID, of course, they are dealing with COVID. And so what does climate change after COVID look like in some of those places? And how can we use foreign policy and foreign relations and diplomacy in working with them to help them, to bring them along? As many problems we have in the US, they're compounded, of course, in many of these places.
So we have three major levers with working internationally. We have a defense, obviously, national security interests. We have diplomatic interests as well as development interests. Climate change, I believe, is going to require an overhaul of how we approach these things. And you can think about it in terms of, for example, the immigration that we're seeing at our southern border. The estimates for immigration from climate change are astounding. I just saw a new one related to the Pakistani flooding, 700 million displaced by 2030. These are just numbers that we haven't thought through. What do those mean? And if you peel it back, we need to cut emissions so that these impacts don't continue to pound these countries. Their impacts are not evenly distributed, and the infrastructure to deal with them is not evenly distributed. So Pakistan is one of the countries that's at highest risk. It's in the top 10 disaster-prone nations, and it has some of the poorest, flood infrastructure to protect against this. But you look at the Northern Triangle, where we've seen this surge of miners. Similarly, they're disaster-prone areas. They've had back-to-back hurricanes, and they also have a lot of other problems, criminal activity, and then they've had droughts that have affected their agriculture production. So we're going to see a lot of people on the move. And is the best way for us to just say we're going to get as defensive as possible and try to keep them out? Or are we going to think about how do we encourage them to want to stay at home? Most people want to stay where they are. Displacement isn't, for the vast majority of people, the desired outcome. It's because they have to go, either because conditions have gotten so bad, or their house has been wiped out, or they have no way of livelihood. So they're on the move. And so that means we're going to probably have some defensive, because we will not want everyone to come to the United States. And there'll be some choices, as we're seeing reflected on that, certainly to keep ourselves safe. We don't want terrorists, for example, to enter, but we also will want to help them stay at home. And that means that we need development investment in those areas to help them thrive, and have good lives and deal with the impacts at home. And that will require a strategic overlay that plays into the diplomatic world, plays into the planning for national security, and plays into the development mold. Just like we don't have a national adaptation plan, we don't really have that either. But over the long term, we need to figure out what are the hotspots, where are these people going to go, how are we going to make sure, and we do need to look at it from the interest of the United States. What are we going to do to help these other countries thrive in a warming world? And that work needs to be done. We need to actually make sure that certainly in our defense agencies, there's a full understanding of what climate change means. And that's an unfamiliar role. I remember one great anecdote, a military officer saying, I get what you say about climate change, but I'm trained to take that hill. So what hill do I need to take here? And it's not about war. It's about investing in people to make sure that they can thrive as well.
Big challenges. I'm thinking about the immigration and migration, and even within the US, we were talking a little bit before the webinar about the Gulf Coast and, the challenge of managed retreat and how people don't even want to think about that living along the coast, for example, within the US because of its impact on real estate prices. But there are planning efforts underway. Can you talk a little bit about the planning efforts that are underway and what can we expect and what direction are we going in directions we shouldn't be and that we should be and so on?
Well, this is probably one of the harder topics for the United States. We will actually see land disappear. And then we also have a huge amount of building occurring in what's called the wildland urban interface. The land will disappear because of coastal flooding or floods, erosion of riverbanks, and then the wildfires. It could just be so unsafe. Typically, if a wildfire has occurred in the past, firefighters will say there's a good chance that wildfire could occur there again. So some of these areas are quite dangerous to continue to live in. So how do we get people to pull back? We have this term managed retreat, which has already become, there are dirty words in some locations. And it's not, once you think it through, I think it's not hard to understand. United States, American dream, we all want our own home. It's typically the largest asset that most families have. And now you're saying you may have to leave your home, and we're going to be announcing that and disclosing that. People react poorly. So when Oregon with wildfire did the right thing, they'd had terrible wildfires. They did some mapping that showed future wildfire risk. They released it statewide. Some owners went nuts. This is going to ruin our property value. And the state pulled the map back. Similarly, in California, we've seen coastal communities, the California Commission, Coastal Commission responsible for public access to the beaches, said to some of these towns, what's your managed retreat plan? So you're going to still have public access to the beach. And the towns went nuts. We're not going to talk about managed retreat. We're not putting that in our plans. We have a challenge talking about this. We don't have a lot of good examples here in the United States of towns that have already relocated. We've discovered that there's all of us, particularly the older you get, have often a great tie to our place. There's a lot of emotional attachment to homes. There's just an aversion to change. We value what we have. We don't, and the loss of that more than we value the gain. So a lot of psychological barriers to success in this space. I will say the one noteworthy spot is Louisiana, probably the place you'd least expect to have, not least, but it's a state heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And it's losing a football field of land every 90 minutes for a variety of reasons. So it's rapidly eroding. But they use some money from the BP oil spill to do some very serious planning. And now they have a plan that covers a number of parishes within Louisiana that actually talks about which land will be preserved and which land won't. And we need to figure out how to replicate that for these communities that are going to be losing land and have that discussion. And why is that so important? Because to have houses in places that are at risk, you have to have infrastructure, you have roads, you have sewers, you have electric lines, you have a lot of investment, and a lot of that is often underwritten by taxpayers. So does it make sense for that to continue? And we've just seen some pushback, and so it will be a challenge to work on this. But as I say, planning also helps people get used to the scenario. This is what it says it's going to happen. So what are we going to do here?
Planning, yes.
It sounds dull, but if you don't focus on the problem, it's hard to have a solution that everybody can work toward.
Right. No, it makes complete sense. It's like communication. You have to do these things. You have to communicate to plan. You have to plan and plan the communication in. We've talked a lot. Obviously, there's important roles for governments at all levels, from local to state to national, international. What about the private sector? I mean, what about insurance companies, for example? Is there much of a role there, or is this, they're just, they write their contracts for 1 year, and so that's all they care about. They're looking 1 year ahead and no further. Is there an important role for the private sector there or in other areas that that we should be thinking about?
Insurance will definitely play a role here. And insurance, if insurance is widely available and purchased, it can have a material difference for obviously the person who enjoys the insurance, but also the community. If everyone else is insured, then the community itself is repaired and people get back to work, and the tax base remains intact. And I should say, I am on the board of Munich Reinsurance Companies, their domestic subsidiaries here in the United States. And when you talk about the insurance company, there are two prongs here that will play a role. The first are the primary insurance companies. That's like your State Farm. You go out and get your own property insurance. And those are the insurers that are saying, this risk is pretty big. And I think, and some of them are saying, I don't want to be so exposed. So you see in California, Department of Insurance, and I chair a working group for them on climate and insurance. And the commissioner has said, in certain areas that have just experienced a wildfire, I'm not going to let you go, insurance company. You're going to still have to offer insurance there for at least another year, because that would be too abrupt for these people. Can't sustain that forever. And then in Louisiana, they're having trouble. The private insurers are having trouble backing their insurance. And what does backing insurance mean? That means they buy from the reinsurer. And the reinsurers are global risk experts who insure insurance companies. And because they insure across the globe, they have huge assets. And then they can have sufficient assets so that if a Florida gets really hit, and if they think it was good to back the local insurers, they can cover that. They have enough assets that they can cover that loss. But what we're seeing, not with all reinsurers by any means, is there are some reinsurers have said, you know what? Climate's just too big. We're going to go insure other stuff. We don't want this insurance, this property risk anymore. And so that's caused a contraction in some places in reinsurance available, and then of course causes the prices to go up, which makes it harder for the primary insurers to purchase that reinsurance and then provide insurance at a cost that's attractive to people. And what we know is if the cost gets out too high, people don't buy the insurance. They go bare. And that means when the disaster hits, that community is significantly impacted. Could be the banks that have mortgages on those homes, because the federal government will come to the rescue, but not to the extent that people assume. It's often about $35,000 for a home if it's not insured. So this is a brewing challenge, how the private insurers will respond. But I will say that the reinsurers are all over climate risk. They are paying very close attention to it and trying to figure out creative ways. And I'll just say one last thing. California just decided to encourage private insurers, or require private insurers to reduce premiums, the cost of insurance, if a community or a person has done work to reduce their wildfire risk. And that's the kind of innovative effort to keep these insurance premiums affordable so that more people are protected.
And I know that I've heard people from FEMA say if a community experiences a true catastrophe, it will not recover. So once you have that, you've got to plan and prepare. There's a question here, though, in a different direction here that I want to get. A lot of people were interested in hearing your response to the question of what federal policy and action was most effective during the pandemic that could be similarly leveraged during the climate crisis. Are there national action? I don't know if there are specific ones. Maybe the answer is planning.
No, I think, well, I think taking advantage. So South Korea had taken advantage of the prior crises, never, that's saying never let a good crisis go away to waste, and they applied it. We chose to throw out our plans honestly, and I'd been a part of at least the maintenance of those plans when I was at DHS. We just threw them out, and we decided to try to create it along the way. And that meant all the relationships that are built through planning, all the assumptions kind of crumbled, and we were less effective in our ability to respond. But I think the big takeaway for me in terms of what lesson from COVID, it's the power of a social safety net. And we saw nations across the globe spin up so rapidly to get money out to their populations. And we know that if we can get cash out, particularly to our most vulnerable populations or better services, they will have better outcomes. And I hope that we study the successes of these social networks. And there's examples pre-existing COVID, for example, in Brazil and other places, where these programs have pulled people out of poverty. And if you think about climate, it could be a program that pulls people out of poverty and then helps them figure out how to keep themselves safer going forward during climate disasters. So that would be my number one lesson, is that, hey, that's what we decided to do when we were really hit with a disaster. Why don't we put that in place in a way that is meaningful? And that could include insurance protection. Some countries like Morocco have a disaster insurance that they just offer to everybody so that everyone's covered if you have a horrible thing happen. And to examine those types of choices that would leave greater numbers of people better off. What is it? Most Americans don't have $400 to evacuate. That's a serious problem when you're looking at the kinds of storms and wildfires we're having.
Thank you. There's just a quick technical question here about sharing the source for the $15 invested versus $1. $15 benefit to $1 invested. And someone said, is it the NIBS mitigation doc for the second? I don't know.
I'm not 100% sure if it came from the National Institute of Building Sciences, but they coordinated with FEMA, and certainly the one in $11 comes from that study, but I'm happy to, after this, get you exactly where the $15 figure came from. But there are a number of studies. Cost benefit analysis is also an area that we could really work on to better incorporate the value of future risk. Right now, we don't look far enough out. So when we're deciding what kind of, simple example, how high the bridge should be to avoid floodwaters, we don't value the fact that there'll be even bigger floodwaters, few decades ahead. So we don't build it high enough or flexibly enough so that it could be raised, for example, if it needed to be. So we need a better cost benefit analysis across the board.
And there was another suggestion related to that one, that maybe you should run for office. Have you thought about that?
Well, no, I haven't. I did run for office. Technically, I was elected as a judge, but if no one opposes you, and I was fortunate no one would ever oppose me, my name never appeared on the ballot. But I have technically been an elected official. But no, that's not where my strength lays. I think there's very special skills to be a politician, and I don't perceive myself as having all those skills. So I enjoy what I do. Thank you, though.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and all of these incredible ideas. A little bit scary, but also a few reasons for hope and some inspiration here, I hope, for people to dig in further. Thank you again. And Eric, I will pass it off to you for any closing comments or logistics.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Thank you, Dr. Marlon. This was the second event in the Yale Center for Environmental Communications Fall 2022 Speaker Series. Everyone will receive a follow-up email after this with the recording, as well as a link to our takeaways from the event. And we will be back soon and hope you will join us for our next event. We'll be sending details soon. Take care, everyone.